Welcome to this personal pondering through the Psalms, and this one's going to be very different for a number of reasons. First of all, we're going to look at two Psalms together, Psalms 42 and Psalm 43, and I'll explain in a moment why we're going to take that. We're going to take two studies to look at these two Psalms as one. And also, in this first study, I'm not really going to look so much at the content or the detailed content of the Psalm. I want to introduce you to a bit of the background and also, again, the importance of the structure. Those of you that have been following these ponderings will know that I'm a bit of a nerd about the structures of the Psalms. And I do so unashamedly because I'm a great believer in that how God says something is part of and as important as what God says. The structure of the Psalm very often helps us unearth the real meaning of it and unearth the treasures of that Psalm. So we're going to look at Psalms 42 and 43. But I want you first of all to notice that if you have a good version of the Bible in front of you, just above Psalm 42, it will tell you that we have moved from book 1 into book 2 of the Psalms. Many folk have read the Psalms all their lives and never noticed these divisions, but the actual book of Psalms is divided into 5 books, and that's not really a subject for these studies. But one interesting difference is that most of the first book of 41 Psalms were written by David, whereas the second book introduces us to some other composers of the Psalms as well, including here in Psalm 42, the sons of Korah. Now let me come back to them in just a moment, but let me tell you why I'm going to take Psalm 42 and 43 together. And my reason is I'm personally utterly convinced, as are many commentators, though not all, that originally these two Psalms were one. And somehow, for some reason we don't know, they got separated. But if you just read the two Psalms together without noticing the division between them, I think you'll pretty soon come to the conclusion they make a very fine, logical unit. Let me give you a couple of clues. Notice, for example, there's a heading above Psalm 42, but not above Psalm 43. And in this part of the book of Psalms, this book 2, which takes us through to Psalm 72, there's only one other psalm that doesn't have a heading above it. So it's very unusual for Psalm 43 in this book not to have a heading. I think that links it to Psalm 42. But even more importantly, I want you to notice the content. There are two refrains that occur in Psalm 42 and Psalm 43 together. So notice, for example, that Psalm 42 verse 9b is the same as Psalm 43 verse 2b. There's a repeat. It's like another incident of that same refrain within the same passage. So Psalm 42 verse 9b says, "Why do I go mourning? Because of the oppression of the enemy." The same thing comes in Psalm 43 and verse 2b. And then additionally, in Psalm 42, there's two refrains that come in verse 5 and again in verse 11, and is repeated again in 43 verse 5. So you have this repetition that comes through the Psalms, and I think that links them together as one psalm that for some reason later on got divided. And we'll look at the content more in our next study as we look at it. But here's what I really want you to notice by way of background. This psalm, we're told, verse 42, is a maskil, we're not quite sure what that means, perhaps some liturgical or musical term, of the sons of Korah, or it could be for the sons of Korah. So it could have been written by the sons of Korah, or it could have been written for them. Now, who are the sons of Korah? Well, in the days when the Psalms are being compiled, they're the liturgical, Levitical leaders of the worship. They're the equivalent of the praise band leaders, the worship leaders of their day. And they're appointed for that by David as part of his organization of the tabernacle and then ultimately the temple worship. Well, so what? What about them? Well, they wrote, or there are 11 Psalms in the whole book of Psalms designated for the sons of Korah. But go back into the Old Testament, go back into Numbers, for example, and you'll find there's a record there. Do you remember of Korah's rebellion against Moses and against Aaron? You can look up the details for yourself. And as a result of that rebellion, thousands of Hebrew people were put to death by God. But we read in Numbers 26 verse 11 that the sons of Korah were not put to death. And so here we have, about 400 years later, descendants of Korah, who led a great rebellion against God's anointed leaders of his people. And he was put to death, and those who rebelled with him, but his immediate sons, or some of his immediate sons, weren't. And they passed on a dynasty, if you like, of worship leaders, who I'm sure saw a great privilege in being appointed to lead the worship of the people of God, when they were the direct descendants of somebody who was put to death by God for being a rebel and an insurgent in the camp. It's a great, wonderful picture to us of how God spares his children, and how God gives us something useful to do with our lives, when he could so easily have just wiped us off the face of the earth. So the sons of Korah are the worship leaders of the day. And this is their psalm, either by them or for them. And we'll take a look at that in more detail in our next study. And until then, the Lord bless you.